All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. We got a good group this morning. Hi, everyone. As I just mentioned, can you believe it? It's the final week. I can believe it. And on behalf of myself and our presenters, we really thank you for being here and hope you've learned a bunch. It's going to help you really improve how you run and manage your business. Welcome to those joining us for the very first time. And welcome back if you've been with us for the past 5 weeks. Yeah, it has been 5 weeks of jam-packed knowledge and information to really help you do business better. I'm your host, Cameo Roberson, founder of Atlas Park Consulting, a business management consulting platform for financial advisors and service-based entrepreneurs, where we teach our clients how to build habits instead of just learning techniques and never implementing them. A lot of CEOs wonder, what is my business going to look like when it grows up? At Atlas Park, we've created a roadmap to manage the business of financial planning better, resulting in hours back in your day and a business running like a well-oiled machine. Our coaching and virtual COO solutions help our clients clarify business vision, move ideas from concept to profit, organize operations, escape burnout, and save time. Last week, we had Ben Douglas of Ryman Law sharing on the risk of a poorly drafted investment management agreement, a few war stories, and what advisors can do to protect themselves. The last thing you want as a firm owner is to leave yourself open to significant vulnerabilities. Ben provides legal counsel for SEC-registered firms in areas of asset management, including private investment advisors and wealth managers. A few housekeeping items as we get started. So to save any background noise, please mute your line if you're not already speaking. Feel free to put questions in the chat box and we'll moderate them. Or you can unmute yourself and ask your question live if you prefer. Winners of our giveaways will be announced at the end of today's session. And again, we really appreciate your time and thank you for being here. So one of our sponsors, Nudge, is a tool for financial planners to help assign tasks to their clients and have shared to-do lists to manage those assigned tasks. So that's going to be one of our giveaways at the very end. And really helping your clients remember all the important things that need to get done. So now that I've set the stage, let's go ahead and get started with today's presentation. Let me know when you can see my screen. If you just wave your hand and let me know that you can see it. Fantastic. Wonderful. So now let me guess. As many of you are financial advisors, and as you went through your certification program, whether you're a CFP, a CFA, or other designation, you probably didn't get in the business to build systems and streamline processes, right? Would you agree? Yet, as a business owner, many of us got a crash course in how to manage our businesses. So myself and Ariel are going to be sharing with you how do you build systems and streamline processes and have a live case study with a client that we both share with Gen Next Wealth. So our goal today is to shed light into the possibilities present when you build systems and streamline processes within your firm. Our talk today is going to enlighten and hopefully encourage you as you think about how do you improve your practice. But before we get into the details, let's talk about an actual system in motion, a system you're participating in right now. Now you might be wondering, what is Cameo talking about? So the Manage Your Practice webinar series, this is a system in motion. Late last year, I thought about how I could bring together a group of experts to collectively share their expertise across sales and marketing, executive leadership, compliance, business planning, client whisperer techniques, and attracting your best clients. Now, figuring out how to build it, find the talent, organize it, automate it, and then promote it was a highly interrelated set of steps needed to happen in order to meet the end goal. A few tools I used in this process include Zoom, YouTube, Schedule Once, which is my calendar scheduler, and MailerLite. All of this was coordinated to reach a goal. So our collective goals were to provide at least 45 or more attendees with access to 7 top-notch experts over 6 weeks, learn strategies to improve business post-COVID-19 in a virtual and convenient format. Now, easy enough, right? Well, yes and no. The series needed to not only have a goal, but a flow of information that made sense for the attendees, all of you, and our featured presenters. So our series experts, for those of you who weren't with us the first 5 weeks, and if, as I say your name, if you just raise your hand so folks can see you, Dominic Grew of Elevate Business Coaching, Bruce Lefetra of Eastwood Strategy Advisors, Steve Johnson of Scaling Sales, Christy Royce of KLR Consulting, Ben Douglas of Ryman Law, Ariel Minicozy of Sphinx Automation, and myself. Now, I share all of this to highlight the importance of a system when you're trying to get anything done efficiently, avoiding rework, and missing your intended target or goal. At a base level, a system is a set of procedures according to which something is done, an organized framework that can be created and recreated at any time, depending on your goals. Now, when you think about your own systems and really taking the steps needed, coordinated to meet the goals within your own practice. And this system, when built out, is going to really highlight the procedures it took to get to that end goal. Now, I have to ask, did we meet our goal? Did this system work well? And you can throw your comments in the chat box. Did you feel like you gained a lot of information over these 6 weeks? Did you get the information on the Zoom room? Did you get reminders and texts about what was going on? So let me just tell you, it didn't just happen. And whenever you're building your own systems within your practice, it takes proper planning and vision to build it. Your client experience is a system. Your onboarding is a system. Your client meeting prep is a system. The actual meetings that you deliver to your clients is a system. Now, what happens when you take all of those aspects, all of those individual systems, and you put them together in an organized fashion? You set yourself up to do the business of financial planning better. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper into what exactly is the business of financial planning. What does that really mean? And how systems can help you do business better. We have the pleasure of an advisor client, both Ariel and I worked with, to help him do the business of financial planning better. And he's on the call today, and I'm going to introduce him shortly. I see there's a couple of comments in the chat box. I want to take a look and see. Thanks so much for sharing that this system, this Manager Practice webinar series has been really helpful for you. So, your ability as an advisor to offer comprehensive financial planning, as I mentioned, goes beyond your technical knowledge. Your competency is not in question. And I know a lot of you spent years getting that technical knowledge. Now, I want to mention that your ability to be 100% more effective in your business happens when you are able to understand what's required and move your business forward and commit to doing the work. Easy enough, right? Easy, it's easy, right? So, as I mentioned, being 100% more effective when you understand what's required and you commit to doing the work. Early on in the series, Dominic talked about business planning and figuring out what your goals need to be and start mapping out those goals so that you can actually get things done. That's really what's going to make the difference in you staying where you are in your business and being able to move forward confidently. So, how are you building your house? I shared this story recently, and it really captures how we've got to think about our businesses. Now, I have to tell you, I'm a huge fan of Starbucks. So much so that I find myself in the drive-through line a few times a week. True story. Now, as I get to the order screen, I'm greeted with a pleasant voice. Welcome back. What can I get for you today? A grande white mocha, no foam, no whip is usually what I respond with. And the voice on the other end says, and what else can I get for you? I shout out a cheese Danish, double toasted. The voice then responds with, and what else can I get for you? At that point, I've reached my limit. I say, Cameo, enough, and say thank you. Now, as I drive to the window to pay, I'm greeted by a smiling barista who asks me how I'm doing and if I'm on my way into the office. I get my treats, I tell them thank you, have a good day, and they respond with the same. Now, I drive off just happy that that experience was so pleasant. So in a large corporation like Starbucks, they've managed to think about me, the customer, and how I'm set up to buy from them happily on a very consistent basis. What I've determined is it's the convenience, the consistency, and predictability that I appreciate. I don't have to guess what's going to happen when I go to Starbucks. Now I ask the question, have you taken the same care in your own business? Are your processes smooth? Are they a little bit choppy, maybe hit or miss? So as we look at this picture of a house, what I just described as my Starbucks experience may correlate well to your prospect to new client onboarding experience, which covers 4 of the 5 categories listed. So you think about generating revenue, selling your services, building operational structure, providing your services, leveraging technology, using technology to enhance the delivery, and which Ariel is going to be talking about more shortly with automations. Maximizing your human capital, having support staff, care planners, etc., to help you deliver the service. Now, our featured guest wanted a seamless, repeatable process in his practice. Let me take a moment and introduce him. Emlyn Miles Mattingly, welcome to the Manager Practice webinar series. We're so grateful that you're here with us today.
Thanks for having me, Cameo.
So Emlyn is a solo practitioner managing an independent advisory practice in Central California. He has over 80 client households, and his firm is dedicated to changing the complexion of wealth and providing independent fee-only advice. He has a podcast, Minority Money Podcast, and is one of 3 co-founders of the Black Next program, a platform to help bring more Black and Brown financial planners into the profession. Now, Emlyn was looking to position his firm for growth, leveraging systems and processes, and bring on outsourced talent. So a couple of the problems that Gen Next Wealth faced is, 1, he outgrew his initial onboarding processes, and Ariel's going to be sharing on that more. Changes in technology and upgrades that happens constantly in our profession, and really directing the growth of his firm strategically. So Emlyn's practice was experiencing a lot of growth from his visibility in social media, industry publications, his podcast is wildly popular. And so he knew very quickly that he needed to revamp those existing processes. Some of the goals that Gen Next Wealth has is working with a smaller number of ideal clients. You don't always have to have 100+ clients in order to be successful. You can work with a smaller niche demographic of clients if you so choose. And he wanted to offer concierge services at a higher price point and leverage a lifestyle business, which can be small and very entrepreneurial, but with good systems. Emlyn doesn't want to grow his firm to enterprise size, but he did recognize the benefits of having those good systems, standardizing his processes to serve his clients. And this is a really big area I see for lifestyle practices who, let's just be honest, kind of fly by the seat of their pants sometimes because things are very reactive. But when you have good systems and good processes like the large enterprise firms have to have in order to get to that size, you can really find a lot of benefit there. So before I get into the weeds on Emlyn's systems, and as you look at this image, the development of any system begins with an idea, a thought, something you want to achieve. And as you move along the path of this image, we're going to see different icons representing a light bulb, a brain, balancing scales, clock, rocket, other images. But at the very end, you see a target with an arrow going through the center. And this path highlights what's needed to move from concept to profit. The very illustration represents what Atlas Park helps our clients with the idea of visualizing and then building the right systems. So Emlyn recognized that he needed to standardize the way that he does business in order to allow scale, and then add staff in hopes of delegating more. So let's talk a little bit about how systems can transform your business. So as advisors on the call today and other service-based entrepreneurs, it's key to understand how impactful systems can be in your practice. One of my favorite books is The E-Myth Revisited by Michael Gerber. It was a game changer when I built Atlas Park. And it talks about why small businesses fail and how to fix it. There are three key individuals in the book: the entrepreneur, the visionary, the technician who's the worker, and the manager who manages everything. And each one of those roles plays a key part in doing the business. If you've never read this book, I highly recommend it, as it really is going to highlight how each role complements the others in getting things done. And at the end of the day, we want to get things done, right? I mean, that's why we're in business, to serve our clients well and to get things done. So as I mentioned in the Starbucks analogy earlier, do you think the folks at Starbucks have to wonder how they're going to deliver services each day? Do they come in the store wondering, okay, how am I going to make that white chocolate mocha? How am I going to make that caramel frappuccino? Do you think that they have their sales conversations down pat across the organization? Absolutely. And so much so that their service delivery is proactive. And these are some of the benefits of systems. Service is proactive always and never reactive. And what reactive implies is that you're not prepared for what's coming next. And it's probably second nature for them. They don't have to wonder what ingredients go into the soy chai latte or the caramel macchiato. And as I think about it, when you visited any Starbucks, how often do they get your drink wrong? 10% of the time? Less than that? I can count on one hand how many times they've gotten my drink wrong, and when they did get it wrong, what steps they took to fix it. My drinks have been predictable, consistent, and these are important steps as business owners as you think about how you can refine your businesses and how you can deliver exceptional service. And at the end of the day, when you really have good systems, and Emlyn will be able to talk on this soon, you talk about peace of mind because you don't have to guess each time a new client is onboarded. So how did Atlas Park assist? And so what we did with Emlyn is helped him to understand his client segmentation and services, to better align his prices as he looks to pinpoint higher value clients, business improvement roadmap, how to do business better across those 5 areas I talked about earlier, the business planning and strategy, business development, the optimizing operations, leveraging technology, and then maximizing human capital. And the last piece, which I'm going to spend a little bit more time on, is articulating the financial planning process and how you can define that. So this next slide, new client onboarding experience, may look very familiar to a lot of advisors on the call, as it contains steps that most advisors need to cover in their new client onboarding. High-level components including data gathering, administration, the investment management component, and really breaking down each one of those high-level areas into specific tasks that need to get done. Now, I've said a lot there. I want to pause for just a moment and see if there are any questions that I can address. And if not, then we'll just keep rolling and have questions answered at the end. So the new client onboarding experience as it relates to Gen Next Wealth. So we assisted Emlyn with building out his financial planning process. And if you think of, the 6 or 7 steps that are needed to actually deliver the service. And the way this was broken down, it included steps from getting from an inquiry on your website to closing the sale, to onboarding a new client, and really taking them through the multiple meeting process and ongoing engagement. And this was broken down into workflow phase, category, description, owner, service level, and task. And it was important to identify each one of these individual steps because when it came time to automate the process, it was very clear what we were doing, why we were doing it, and who needed to do it. And so this particular slide details those 6 areas that I just mentioned, and apologies for it being a little small, but I'm going to focus more on the prospective client phase. And as you go through this particular slide, we go to the onboarding a new client, the get organized, and if you're reading it from left to right, the very end of this particular spreadsheet lists the task. And the task is something that can then be automated. The task represents the actual workflow or the steps needed to complete each individual phase. And the very end of his process includes asset transfer, the financial plan, preparing the financial plan, delivering the financial plan, and final recommendations, and then what it looks like for the ongoing engagement with Gen Next Wealth. So a little bit closer look in identifying the workflow category. So I mentioned earlier, the very first step is how a request to schedule a call with Emlyn is identified. And Ariel is going to talk a little bit about how that process is now automated for him. Having a pre-profile questionnaire, and then taking the individual through that scheduling process to then get to the actual meeting, the initial consultation, and having a very clear process for how you plan to speak with the client, share his services, as well as closing new business. So all of this was done because we wanted him to be very clear on what his service delivery was. We didn't want him to have to think about this every time a new client was going to be onboarded. We've also been able to create custom templates and checklists to support the process, as well as agendas for each meeting, and then client meeting topical calendars for future meetings that Emlyn is going to have with his clients. So I share all of this to say that if you automate a process that has errors, all you've done is automate the generation of those errors. And this is why it's so important to figure out what the process is ahead of time before you then try to leverage technology and automation to streamline that process. So with Emlyn's onboarding to ongoing meeting steps articulated, he's really set up well to begin the automation steps. This is where we can move from process and system creation to automation, which is completely possible when you have a good process. And so automation, we've identified the Gen Next Wealth process. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Ariel, who's going to share even more about how do we then go from automation to effectiveness within the Gen Next Wealth practice.
Thank you so much, Cameo. I'm just going to make sure that I have control of the screen here. Let me just make sure. Okay, perfect. Oops, went a little too far. There we go. So like Cameo mentioned, before we even start talking about technology, before we even start talking about automation, we want to make sure that we build not only the foundation of the house, which is your systems, your automation and your technology systems, but we also want to have a blueprint, which is that process outline that Cameo shared on her previous slides. I think Emlyn is a fantastic case study for us to reference because Emlyn was one of my very first clients when I started Sphinx Automation 3 years ago. He saw the transformation of my business from the ground up. And I'm not ashamed to admit that we've made a lot of mistakes along the way, but hopefully we've learned from those mistakes and we've improved our process. And that's really the goal when we work on processes and when we work on technology, Nothing's ever in its final stage at the very beginning, but as long as we see the end in sight and we keep moving forward and making progress, we're doing the right things. So I say all that to say that when we first worked with Emlyn at Sphinx, we set up some automations, we set up some systems and technology, but we hadn't gone through the process of documenting what those systems would look like in terms of Emlyn's workflows. We had a really loose idea. We had a general sense. Emlyn was an expert in what he does, and he knew how to perform financial planning process. He knew how to make a sale with a client, but there was nothing really documented. And so we set up a bunch of things that we ended up ultimately having to go back and revise, which is what we did in this second project here. And before I worked on changing any of the technology, before Emlyn and I came together and looked at updating the automation, I first encouraged Emlyn to reach out to Cameo and have her help him think through what that system will look like, think through a little bit more clearly what that process will look like, especially because in the interim, since Emlyn and I last worked together, he also ended up hiring an assistant to help him with some of those processes. So we had to incorporate her as well. Let's see, I'm not advancing Cameo. Do you mind changing this? Oh, there we go. Okay, just took a sec. Tech issues. So when I was working with Emlyn, when I work with any client, and even if you're doing this on your own, when we think about technology, I think it's not as important to worry about the particular systems that you're using, but rather to make sure that they're meeting some general principles and general aspects. For example, Cameo mentioned Schedule once as her scheduling system. That's a system that Emlyn was previously using, but when we did the second revision, we decided to switch him over to Calendly instead because it better met his needs. But a lot of what we're going to talk about can be done on either system or even other systems like Acuity, You Can Book Me, X.ai, etc. As long as the tech meets these 4 principles here on this slide, that it's secure and compliant, that's always the #1 consideration above everything else. We want to make sure that our clients' information is protected and that we're adhering to compliance regulations. As long as it's easy to use for both internal team members and for clients to make sure that we have that convenient, predictable, and consistent experience that Cameo so wonderfully highlighted, that it's affordable, both financially affordable and affordable as far as time is concerned. I always think it's important to highlight that particular aspect because as business owners, especially when we're in the early stages of our business growth, I think often we try to spend more of our time and less of our money on doing processes and working with clients. And yet, as we get to that middle ground or even in the advanced stages of growth, I think we start to learn that our time is valuable as well. And finally, that the technology and that any automation you set up facilitates a streamlined and efficient process. Because at the end of the day, your goal as a business owner, again, like Cameo so wonderfully highlighted, is that you didn't get into this business, probably, I mean, there might be some general exceptions, but you probably didn't get into this business to spend time doing administrative tasks, filling out paperwork, collecting client data and typing it into your CRM software. You got into this business to help people make a difference in their lives through their money. And we can utilize not only people and in delegating to our team members, but we can also utilize our technology to make that goal happen as well. So let's get into some specific systems. Bear with me one moment again. This slide is not changing. I apologize. Do you mind moving the slide forward, Cameo? Okay, there we go. Keeps jumping. There we go. Thank you. So when it comes to scheduling, scheduling is the #1 piece of technology that I recommend any service-based business has. Not only advisors, attorneys, CPAs, anybody who works with clients should really have scheduling. And the reason I say that is because how many of you, and feel free to come off mute and jump in or drop it in the chat, but how many of you have had the experience where you're trying to meet with somebody, whether it's one of your own clients or you're trying to meet with another service provider, and you're corresponding by email and saying, hey, when are you available? I'm available on these days. Do any of those times work for you? Okay, no, I'm not available on any of those times. Do you have some other options? How about you? Okay. And before you know it, you've spent 2 hours going back and forth, sending 10 emails to try to figure out a day that works for everybody involved. Where if you had a scheduling system in place, it would be as simple as sending the link to the client or the service provider sending the link to you, choosing a day and time that you're both available, and continuing forward. The reason that we want to do that, or part of the reason that we want to do that, is that last bullet point on this slide, which is keeping leads and clients in the funnel to guide them to the next step. And the reason I think that's super important is it comes back to the idea of human psychology and friction. When we're working with clients, and you've probably even experienced this in your own business when you're choosing service providers or choosing a doctor, for example, or choosing a business coach. When you're excited about moving forward and engaging somebody's services, you are eager to take the next step. The idea of filling out a form and providing documents doesn't seem so intimidating when you're in the mindset of doing that process. But as soon as you get out of that mindset, your kids need help with their homework, you have to go to sports practice, it's COVID, and I have to worry about how I'm going to make my business run, you start getting distracted and you're less interested in working on taking that next step. So we want to make sure that with your own leads and your own clients, we're doing the same thing. We're reducing the amount of friction that they face when deciding to work with you. And at each stage of the process, it's as seamless and as smooth as possible for them to move forward, so they don't, number one, delay the process, and number two, they don't fall out of the process completely. The way that we do that too is making it clear which event type should be booked. Going back to Emlen's example in particular, when he was using Schedule Once, he had a single booking page with a list of all of his different event types. And there was an event for existing clients, an event for new prospective clients, and an event for his podcast speakers to book with him. And Emlen found that people were booking the wrong meeting. They didn't really know which one was applicable to them, whether it was a free consultation or a check-in call. They kind of sound the same a little bit. And even though he put in parentheses after the check-in call for existing clients, people still weren't getting the message. It was a little confusing. And in particular with Schedule Once, he didn't have the ability to create separate links for each different event type without creating a new booking page. And in a moment, we'll see that when we switched over to Calendly, we were able to create, thank you, Cameo, we were able to create different event types with unique links for each event that he could link to different buttons on his website. So now when a new prospective client comes to his website, right on the top on the call to action on his homepage, there's a link that allows them to book a free consultation. There's no question, should I book a consultation or should I book a check-in call? It's seamless, it's obvious, and they click the button, they pick a day, they pick a time, and they continue forward. If you don't mind just jumping back for a sec, Cameo, other direction. Thank you. The second thing we want to look at with scheduling in particular is we want to make it easy for team members to book clients or send the link for them to book on their own. And when we get a little further, I'll talk about why that's important and how that will work. And we also want to make sure, whether it's us setting up the systems or whether it's you doing it on your own, that the booking forms related to each event type are streamlined, that they appropriately correspond to the stage of the process and the service type that's being rendered. For example, with Emlen, he has both investment management and financial planning clients, and he needs different information from each of those segments of clients. Making sure that the booking form is appropriately reflecting those questions is something that's important to keep in mind. And then we talked already about the keeping clients in the funnel to guide them to the next step. So we'll go forward. And we can pass this as well. Thank you. So when we got to the scheduling outcome, as far as making it easy for clients and team members to book appointments, a best practice that I always recommend is to book the next meeting at the end of each meeting. And this incorporates not only making it easy, but also reducing that friction. Here on this slide, we see 3 different images. And these 3 different images correspond to 3 different ways that Emlen and his team have to allow clients or they themselves to book meetings with clients. So let's say at the end of the meeting, Emlen's meeting with Mr. and Mrs. Smith. And he says, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, Before we wrap up, let's make sure that we get our next meeting on the books. We don't want to let too much time pass before we see you again. We want to make sure that we don't drop the ball and keep things moving forward. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Smith could say, you know what, Emlyn, we really just don't know when we're going to be available to meet with you again. We're going on vacation. The kids have sports practice. Let's see and get back to you. Emlyn could say, sure, no problem. And he could send them the link and that would be fine. But he also could say, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, you know what, let's just put something on the calendar. When you confirm the appointment, you'll get a confirmation email with a link to cancel or reschedule. If you need to move that time, you find out that you have a vacation coming up, no problem. The technology will allow you to just quickly and easily pick a new time that works for you. But at least this way, we know that there's something there and we won't forget to meet again. It's easier to have it on the calendar and change it than to have to go back and add it after the fact. And he can do that in 3 ways. On the left-hand image, we see a snapshot of Calendly's website itself. We have different links for each event type. We can directly copy the link to the booking page. We can create a single-use link that can't be forwarded or it can only be used one time. So let's say it's an existing client meeting and you don't want them to be able to send it to their friend. Use that one-time link. It's unique to that client and that's it. Or Emlyn can also click Add Times to Email and pick up to 3 days where there are open times. And when he goes into his email and pastes from his clipboard, those meeting days and times will be reflected with different buttons that the client can just simply click on to go and book that appointment. In the middle, we have a snapshot of the Calendly extension. And Emlyn is using Google Chrome, so when he has the extension installed, he can either click on the extension from the browser and open up a side panel that shows all of the different meeting types, just like we see here. Or like this image, he can click the button right from his email and he can choose the event type, select 3 days and times that are available, or he can create an ad hoc meaning that it doesn't correspond to a preset event type. And then finally, on the right-hand image, we see a snapshot of the mobile app. He can, on the go, a client calls him and says, hey, Emlyn, I just checked my calendar and I'm ready to get the next meeting on the books. Or a COI refers him a lead that he wants to book a consultation with. Emlyn can pull up his phone, open up the Calendly app, and quickly and easily put that meeting right on the calendar, or copy the link and send it to the client in a text or in an email. And again, Calendly is just one example of a scheduling software. But if we go back to those principles that I mentioned, any system that can do similar activities, it's fine. It's just one example. But I think it's probably the best, especially for his situation. We can go forward. Perfect. And then the other principle that we mentioned too is creating those streamlined booking forms. And my rule of thumb as a best practice is to have no more than 10 to 15 questions at the very max on a booking form. And again, it just goes back to reducing that friction. We found, and this is not academically supported, this is just my experience, but what I found is that when there's more than 15 questions on a booking form, leads or clients are more likely to say, oh, I'll come back to this later when I have more time to fill in the form, and it delays them actually booking the meeting. Where when we put the most important questions on that booking form and send the rest later, which we'll see in the next slide, it usually facilitates leads and clients moving through the process in a more streamlined and efficient fashion. So that leads me to that last point again. We've mentioned it on every single slide. It corresponds to every principle, which is keeping the leads and clients in the funnel. And the best practice here is including the links to the next steps, which in this case is a pre-consultation questionnaire in that confirmation email with, again, the links to reschedule or cancel if needed. And on top of that, depending on which system you use, and both Schedule Once and Calendly do this very well, is that you can also automatically redirect somebody who's booking an event to the next step, further reducing the friction. That way, if they're ready to fill out that next form right on the spot after they book the consult, they go right to the form and they start filling it out. And just in case they're not able to do that, something comes up, they get distracted, they can always go back and reference that link in that email. So we're making sure that we're covering our bases at every step. That leads me really nicely into the forms, which is the next primary technology system that I recommend to advisors. And with forms, we have a couple of different goals. They're similar to what we talked about with scheduling. They're not exactly the same. But number one is to reduce the amount of data re-entry by pre-filling data to the form if possible, syncing the inputs across forms. So let's say we have two separate forms. In Emily's scenario, we have an onboarding questionnaire and we have a dynamic contract that clients can e-sign. And when clients complete that onboarding questionnaire, any data that they've input that's relevant to determining the scope of their engagement or the fee will automatically flow over to that contract, again, making that process super seamless, both for the client and for Emily's team. Automatically linking to the CRM to store contact information. Oftentimes we can do this in one of two ways. We can do what's called a native integration, meaning that we link the two softwares together directly without an intermediary between. Or if we can't, we can always use a system like Zapier, which basically just allows two different softwares to communicate to each other to automate the flow of data from A to B to C and so on and so forth. And we'll see examples of that shortly. We also want to hide irrelevant questions to reduce friction. I'll show an example of that in a moment, and allow clients and team members to easily access the data that was completed on any forms. So we mentioned reducing data reentry. Here is a snapshot on the left-hand side of Emlyn's pre-consultation questionnaire being linked to his MailChimp. Part of the system, and we didn't really have too much time to go into this in this presentation, but I'll just talk through it quickly here. But part of what we set up for Emlyn, and this was part of his original project, was a series of automated emails so that when somebody doesn't move forward in the process, they're getting re-engaged with a series of emails that are reminding them to complete that next step. But what we want to make sure does not happen is that if they've already completed that next step, they've filled out the questionnaire, they've signed their contract, they don't need to get those reminders. If they get them and they've already done the step, it really doesn't facilitate a great client experience. And so linking everything together, making sure we're tracking it from A to B to C ensures that we can customize which reminders and which emails clients and leads are getting at each stage of the process. On the right-hand side, we see a snapshot of the steps of a Zapier integration. There are some systems like Wealthbox or Redtail, Process Street that don't directly sync with Jotform, for example, or PreciseFP. And so we use, in this case, Zapier to sync the data. When somebody fills out that onboarding questionnaire or fills out that pre-consultation questionnaire, we might add the data here to MailChimp again, or update the data in MailChimp, add the information to Wealthbox, in this case, to create a household and a contact record with all the details from the form, and kick off a workflow in Process Street, which we'll see also in just a moment. We also want to, as I mentioned, hide those irrelevant questions to reduce friction. So I mentioned the example on the slide of joint versus individual engagements. And Emlyn also meets with business owners. Depending on the type of engagement or the type of the client status it is, if it's an individual, we don't need to see what is the partner or spouse's name and email address. That just adds an additional question that they need to skip over to get to the next step. Or if they're either an individual or a joint person and they're not doing the engagement under their business name, they don't need to be asked, what is your business name or what is your entity type that you're working under? That's just going to cause more confusion and friction for that client. So using conditional logic, we can hide those irrelevant questions to facilitate that seamless client experience. This I love. I think this has got to be one of my favorite things to automate. And that is allowing clients and team members to easily access the data filled in on the forms. On the right-hand side here, you see a snapshot of a PDF. This is using, again, Jotform, but other systems will do this too, where when a client fills out an onboarding questionnaire, for example, they get an automated email confirmation with a link to the PDF containing the answers that they filled out on the form, minus, of course, personal data like social and date of birth. We take that off because we want to be secure and compliant. But also what we can do with those automated emails is send that collateral for the next step. And last week when Ben talked about compliance, I mentioned the example of automating the delivery of your ADV. Ben also brought that up in his presentation. And this is something that we find really helpful is that when a client completes an onboarding questionnaire before they fill out their contract, the confirmation email contains a link to the IAPD website or the BrokerCheck website where the client can access your ADV. And because this is being done through one of your tech systems, we can actually log the date that the delivery happened and automatically put that date onto your contract so that when the client signs off on having had received the ADV, there's a record of it in your email history from your system. And there's also a signature or an initial on that date. You know exactly when it was sent, but you don't have to go back and check your records in order to fill that in for them to initial off on it. And then last for this presentation, but certainly not least, there's so much more that we could cover, but this will kind of sum it up, is workflows. And our goals with workflows are reducing the amount of data reentry. We talked about that at every step of the process. Fully documenting each step of the process, as Cameo so wonderfully mentioned. She laid it out step by step with all the individual tasks, who's doing them, what are they supposed to be doing. When we want to document those steps, we also want to include any relevant subtasks needed to complete the primary task and attach any collateral necessary to conduct each step of the process, whether that's a meeting or opening accounts, having that paperwork accessible, and so on and so forth. I'll show an example in just a moment. And we also want to make sure that the process is delegated between various team members or various technology systems. And I'll show another example of that too.
Ariel, we got a quick question.
Oh yeah.
From Bridget. What form program vendor is recommended? I think maybe it was JotForm, I'm thinking was.
That's correct, yes.
Okay.
The snapshots in the slides are all JotForm. There's PreciseFP, which is another great tool that we sometimes use. And if you have a specific question about your situation, Bridget, we can talk more during the FAQ if we have time, or if you want to shoot me an email, my contact information will be on the last slide. And Julie asked, is it secure? Yes, JotForm is secure. And if you guys want, I can have Cameo send out a link to their security protocols. They have end-to-end encryption for data transmission and documentation uploads. There's also some additional compliance features that they have too. So here we see that first principle, which is reducing the amount of data reentry. And this is a snapshot of Emlen's consultation workflow. When somebody books that first meeting, that free consultation in Calendly, Zapier, we saw that snapshot of the Zap, pulls through the data from the booking form, the client's name, the client's email, the Zoom link, and the date and time of that meeting, their phone number, everything that Emlen needs to conduct that meeting, including a miniature agenda for him to reference, is right here on that step of his Process Street workflow. He doesn't have to jump around from Calendly to Wealthbox to email to find everything he needs to conduct that meeting. All the data is right here aggregated in one place, and he can easily access it so he doesn't have more work to do than is necessary. Here we see the high-level step-by-step process that Cameo referenced in her previous slides. And we want to make sure that we fully document each step of the process. So on the leftmost image, we have an option if somebody manually schedules a consult, meaning they email Emlen directly or they call him directly and ask to book. We might have Emlen or Shaquana kick off that Process Street workflow by themselves. And then later on, when the client or lead books that meeting, the data from that information will get added automatically back into the already existing Process Street workflow. On the middle steps, we see from the time of the consultation, and if they're going to move forward all the way through to the step of kicking off that next onboarding workflow, which has additional details and collateral attached to it. And finally, if they're not ready to sign on, we also want to make sure to incorporate those follow-ups. Like I mentioned, there's some automated email follow-ups happening on the back end, but Emlen also found it important to do some personalized follow-up. And he might not choose to do this every time, but it's there to remind him in case he does want to do it. The dates will automatically populate. It'll send Emlen an email saying, hey, Emlen, it's been 5 days since you spoke to Mr. and Mrs. Smith. They haven't decided to move forward or haven't committed to onboarding with you as a new client. Give them a phone call, see how they're doing, ask if they have any questions, and keep them engaged. If they don't follow up after that first call, then Emlen's assistant, Shaquana, will pick up the torch for the remaining follow-ups and send a personalized email in addition to the automated emails that are going out, and those dates will automatically populate. And then finally, with workflows, we mentioned delegating the tasks between team members to make sure everyone knows their role, what they're doing, how they're doing it, when they're supposed to be doing it. We have Emlyn and Shaquana. They're two humans, they're two people on the team, but we also have some automated technology involved in running some of these activities. And so what we've done here is we've not only assigned some of the tasks to Emlyn and some of the tasks to Shaquana, but we've also indicated which of those tasks are being automated by the system so that nobody's confused about what am I supposed to be doing. Everybody knows their role, and that keeps that process moving forward with the consistency, predictability, and convenience that Cameo mentioned. With that, I will conclude and we'll open up the floor to some FAQ. We have about 7 minutes or so. But before I do that, I just want to say thank you so much to everybody for being here today. It's been amazing to see you all over the last 6 weeks. And we wanted to make sure that we gave you some additional information. So on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see that Cameo and I have created a 21-day email mini course about automation and processes. You can either type in the link that's at the bottom, or if you open up the photo app on your phone and hold it up to the screen, it'll scan the QR code and open the site for you that way. And if you need to reach us personally, our contact information is also on the left. Please feel free to email us or go to our websites and book a call. We'd be more than happy to talk to you a little bit more. And I actually see that there's another question in the chat, which is, do you recommend something like process street workflows as opposed to building workflows in our CRM, which is in this case, Wealthbox for Julie? And my answer, like any good financial planner, is it depends. You all know that answer, it depends. I would say I personally prefer Process Street. If you're doing a more robust process building, I think it's the more advanced tool. But there are a couple of scenarios where I think having it in Wealthbox or your CRM, if it's not Wealthbox, maybe it's Redtail or Salesforce, makes more sense. And that is, if you live in your CRM as your home base, if you spend the most time there, then it might make sense to have your workflows in Wealthbox. If you are a solo practitioner and you have maybe an admin, not a lot of staff, or maybe you just don't mind having really, really simple workflows and you don't need all the bells and whistles that come along with it, then absolutely having your workflows built out in Wealthbox or your other CRM software is totally fine. And like I mentioned too, when it comes to technology, the systems themselves are not as important as the actual implementation of the system or the process that you're building. So as long as you can do what you need to do, then whatever you choose as far as the technology you're using to do it is absolutely fine. But I think they're both good. Any other questions, technology, process related? Also, if you have questions, Emlyn has so kindly agreed that he'll be able to answer some questions too. If you have questions about his work with us, feel free to jump in, and come off mute and ask, or drop the question in the chat.
And we'll go ahead and moderate that.
How long did it take to implement for Emlyn? Well, I can't speak for Cameo, so I'll let her answer as far as her implementation. But on our side, it really only took us a couple of days. And most of that was just getting everything organized and up and running, and then making some decisions about how to go about implementing. Mm-hmm. For Emlyn in particular, like I mentioned, we had the benefit of having worked together previously. So a lot of what we talked about today was already in place. We just made some minor modifications to his existing technology systems. So Cameo, I don't know how long you guys spent talking.
Yeah, happy to share. So Emlyn and I worked together over a number of months. There were other areas of his practice that we were focusing attention on. When it came to that one piece of articulating and designing his financial planning process, that just took a couple of days.
I think that's really important though. That's a really good question, because I think one of the things that I always encounter, and I'm sure you probably have the same experience, is that we're so eager to get started. Once we know that there's a need, we have that pain point, it's come to the surface, we're just so eager to get it done. But I always tell clients, and I think this is really important, that spending more time up front defining and streamlining what you're going to be building will pay dividends when it comes to the actual building of it. Because like Cameo mentioned, it took several months to work through what are the different nuances of what we want this process to look like. How do we want to facilitate that client experience? But once it's documented and once you know what it'll be, putting it in place becomes a lot smoother, a lot easier, and a lot faster. So definitely I recommend spending more time up front and getting it all right the first time around.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to concur with what Ariel was saying. It may seem laborious, arduous, you don't want to do it, but it is a game changer. When you take the time to build the process on the front end, it makes making those critical business decisions a lot faster on the back end. You don't have to wonder, is this going to work? You've already fully vetted the process, and then you can start to automate.
This is why I always kind of force people to work with Cameo before they work with me, because until you have that system built out, the technology and the automation is really going to just frustrate you. It's going to add more work for you to figure out how you're changing things every time you're working with a new person. Whereas if you have everything standardized, utilizing the technology will make you more efficient rather than less.
Mm-hmm. Ariel, got a question from Kelsey. So, we talked earlier about the nudge tool, which helps to remind clients of their to-dos. How do you navigate some clients being suitable for that kind of automation and client experience? And how do you balance the automation with client willingness to use these different tools?
That is such a good question. I really am glad that you asked that. It's just going to depend. You know your clients better than anyone. So there might be different niches of clients. We work often with advisors that focus on retirees, for example. And I will say that people have this idea that older folks are less tech savvy. That's not always true in my experience, but some of them are less amenable to technology. And you could say, I'm the advisor, this is my process, get with the program or get out. Or you could interview your clients and say, what would work best for you, Mr. and Mrs. Client? Getting as many people as possible on that same process is ideal, but there might be some outliers where you have to do some custom workarounds to facilitate the client experience. So I would say, first, don't assume that your clients are or aren't willing, ask them. And if you do find out that most of them are willing, great, adopt the system. And for those few that are not willing, determine if it makes sense for you to kick them to the curb, politely, of course, or say, let's make a workaround and an exception for you because I really want to continue to work with you in the way that best serves you. It's just going to depend on your practice.
Absolutely. We are, can you believe it? We're at the top of the hour. For those who want to stay on maybe a couple of more minutes to answer questions, we're happy to do so. Want to be respectful of your time. Want to thank Emlyn again for being on the call and allowing us to share his practice as a case study. Even in your own business, these things are completely possible. And so if you have questions about your own scenario, there was, Julie asked at what business stage or size would it be ideal to work with resources like myself and Ariel? And really at the very beginning, there are certain processes that you can start to implement when you have at least, somewhere between 5 and 10 clients, right? Where the fly by the seat of your pants is no longer sustainable. And you're starting to grow very quickly. And so you can definitely consider working with us at the very early parts of your business. Emlyn, would you like to share anything about how business has changed for you?
Yeah, sure. I think, well, first of all, you guys both did a great job on the presentation. So it was awesome. And it's cool to be able to be on the other side of the presentation, right? And hear what you guys are presenting and then see the questions and say, I had that question. I had that question. I had that question. So yeah, I think it was one of the best things I did for my business. Ariel and I talked in like 2017, 18, right after I was getting ready to get things started, and I knew I was going to get an influx of clients, and I did not want to be the bottleneck. And so when we did the automation, it removed me as the bottleneck. And even to this day, I mean, there's nothing better than getting a qualified prospect that you can look at before you ever meet them because they have gone through the automation process. So it makes it's actually helped with capacity and yeah, it just made my life a lot easier.
Thank you for sharing that. We are so happy that you feel that way.
Yes, thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely.
It looks like there's some other questions here. So Dalil asked, are there specific scenarios when it doesn't make sense to use automation? And I think that kind of goes back to the question we just answered from, I believe it was Kelsey, about client willingness, balancing the willingness. I think that there's two types of automations or technology systems that we can think about: client-facing and internal. So you might be right. Maybe there are some scenarios where client-facing automation doesn't make sense. Your clients are not as willing to go and book their own meetings, or they prefer to talk through filling out a form with you together during a meeting versus filling it out ahead of time on their own. Again, I would encourage you to find out if that's really true or if that's just an assumption you have before you make that decision. But if it does turn out to be true, then you might still automate on the back end for you and your internal team. You might have the cloud-based form versus a paper form. For example, you still fill it out during the meeting with your client, but rather than automatically sending it to them ahead of time and then having them fill it out, you fill it out during the meeting, but it's still cloud-based, it's still automatable. We can still use conditional logic to streamline your entry of that data onto the form, and then the automation of the data from that form into your CRM software, into your email marketing software. Client doesn't have to utilize that automation or have to be involved in that process, but you can still be more efficient using automation there.
Ariel, Bridget asked, how do you avoid over-engineering automation? She feels like she falls in love with a new tool every week.
Me too. There's a reason that I have this business. I totally relate to that shiny object syndrome for sure. But I think that the way to do that is to start small. Always start with documenting those processes and figuring out step by step what your ideal workflow is going to look like, your ideal client experience. And once you do that, then start working through in stages and evaluating step by step what is going to be the best tool to help me here. When I work with clients, we always limit the initial engagement to no more than 1 to 3 automations. And I think that's important for that very reason. If you have that shiny object syndrome, you over-engineer, you over-automate, and then you find, I've wasted all this time, energy, and money on something that's not even helping me. It's causing more work. So if you start small and you force yourself to choose wisely, pick one thing, work through it, test it, live with it for a while, make sure it's working for you, and then move on to the next step, do it piecemeal like that, I think that really is helpful in terms of that idea.
Ariel, Rob asked just a few more questions here, everyone. I thought JotForm was only compliant at certain price points.
No, you were right. There is a HIPAA compliant level for JotForm, but the only difference, JotForm is secure end-to-end encryption, even on the free version of the platform. The only difference with the HIPAA compliant version is that the data is segregated on a different server, so it's stored in a separate place than the standard forms. And we always, again, just to be safe, we always take out secure data or personal data like socials and dates of birth. We never put that on the PDF output unless it's protected by a password. If we're sending through data to other systems, we don't ever pass through PII like social and date of birth through things like Zapier. So we do take additional measures, even though it is compliant and secure at all pricing levels, including the free level.
Mm-hmm. And Julie, I may not have answered the second part of your question in terms of what business stage or size would it be ideal to work with either me or Ariel. And really, when you have between that 5 to 10 clients that you're working with and you have an idea of what you want your process to look like, then I can come in and help you further refine that process. But at least having a chance to go through it with 5 to 10 clients is ideal, because then you have an idea of what it is that you want to see happen.
Yeah, I would agree. And I would also add that as far as automating, I usually think automation is most helpful when you reach 25 to 50% of your full capacity. It gives you enough headroom that you can still continue to bring on new clients as you're building out your automations, as you're adding to your technology stack. If you wait till you get to 75 to 100%, you have no wiggle room. And there are things that you're going to need to spend time working through to get that up and running the correct way. And if you're at less than that, maybe it doesn't make sense to spend the time or spend the money at that point. So 25 to 50% is generally my rule of thumb. When you feel like you're at 25 to 50% capacity, then now it's time to start thinking about automating.
And Rob, to answer your question, we are working on making this whole series available to our participants. So we'll keep you posted on that.
It looks like Ray said, it looks like a direct message. Ray asked, do processes help with multiple tools? For example, we use 3 different types of financial planning tools. Oof, I understand that. MoneyGuide Pro, eMoney, and Naviplan. Each tool works best for a different type of client. Can you build a process to help distinguish which tool is best? I think this is a really good question as well, Ray. Thank you for asking it. And when it comes to financial planning specific softwares, whether that's the planning software itself, whether it's a CRM software, whether it's investment management tools like Orion or Black Diamond, automation becomes a little tricky. They tend to be less open to integrating with third-party softwares. So while automating in that particular area might not be helpful or possible, there's some instances where we can do some things, but having a process, even if you can't automate, I do think is super helpful, because you can have specific parameters to tell you and or your team, when do I use each type of tool? You don't have to guess. You don't have to figure it out on the fly. You can say, okay, this client meets this standard, and this standard. We know that if that's true, then we always use Naviplan for this particular type of client. If the client meets this standard, and this standard, then we're going to use eMoney or MoneyGuide Pro. So automation may not be available, but even if it's not, I definitely do think that process and having standardized systems in place can help with making those processes a little smoother.
I think that was the last question. Everyone, thank you again for joining us for this Manager Practice webinar series. We hope that this has been super informative. Reach out to us if you have any questions about your own unique situation. We'd be happy to get those questions answered. And thank you again for participating.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you for having us.
Take care. Bye.